In 1983, a man in St. Louis agreed to invest in a piece of West Texas land he had never seen. He did not ride out to inspect the cattle. He did not walk the range or count the fence posts or ask to see the books. He trusted another man's word. And on the strength of that trust, a ranch was built that would go on to outlast empires. The 4 Sixes, the Wagoner, names that filled newspapers and sale catalogs and the imagination of anyone who ever thought about what private land in Texas could become. One of them grew to more than 1 million acres. The other became a Hollywood backdrop for the most watched Western in television history. Both of them, eventually, were sold. Pitchfork Ranch was not sold. It is still there, still fenced, still running cattle on the same rough ground near Guthrie, Texas, that D.B. Gardner first rode in 1881. Larger now than when it began, more complex, more difficult to explain. This is the story of what it costs to survive next to giants, and why the answer, even after everything, is still not simple. West Texas has always loved its giants. The names that fill books, sale catalogs, and legend are the ones with the most land, the deepest pockets, the loudest myths. And near Guthrie, Texas, few names cast a longer shadow than the 4 Sixes. Beyond that, the Wagoner Empire loomed over the whole idea of what a Texas ranch could become. So here is the question that makes Pitchfork Ranch so unsettling. How did a ranch that began in 1883 with 52,500 acres and 9,750 cattle refuse to disappear in a world built to reward the biggest players? Was it tougher men, smarter breeding, better land, oil, old money from St. Louis? Or was Pitchfork simply more willing than its neighbors to change quietly while still pretending nothing had changed at all? Because the more you look at Pitchfork, the less this feels like a ranch story, and the more it feels like a lesson in how anything small survives next to power. Chapter 1. The ranch nobody expected to outlast the legends. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to West Texas at dawn. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of scale, the kind where distance itself becomes a presence, where you feel the land pressing outward in every direction until the horizon seems less like an edge and more like a warning. Drive the roads near Guthrie, Texas, and that silence has a name on every gate you pass. The 4 Sixes, the Wagoner, the Pitchfork, 3 brands, 3 ranches, 3 different answers to the same question the land has always asked of people who try to hold it. The 4 Sixes began in the 1860s with a man named Burke Burnett and a story that mixed poker winnings with raw ambition. Over generations, it grew into one of the most recognized ranch brands in North America, more than 250,000 acres, a headquarters that shaped the town of Guthrie itself, a name that became synonymous with what Texas cattle culture was supposed to look like. When Hollywood needed to film the television series Yellowstone, they did not have to invent a landscape. They came to the 4 Sixes. The Wagoner Ranch went even further in its time. At its peak, it stretched across more than 1 million acres. 1 million. It was not just a ranch, it was an argument about what private land ownership in America could mean. Oil made the Wagoner family rich in ways that cattle alone never could. For decades, the name seemed indestructible. And then there was Pitchfork. Pitchfork did not begin as a legend. It began as a deal. In 1883, a rancher named D.B. Gardner and a St. Louis businessman named Eugene F. Williams organized the Pitchfork Land and Cattle Company with 52,500 acres and fewer than 10,000 cattle. Compared to what Burnett was building, what the Wagoners were assembling, Pitchfork looked modest, A quiet brand on a rough piece of West Texas ground. Not the biggest, not the loudest, not the one that made the newspapers. But here is what makes Pitchfork worth 68 minutes of your attention. The 4 sixes, after more than 150 years in one family, was sold in 2022. The Wagoner Ranch, after a bitter legal battle that lasted years, and an estate valued at more than $300 million in 1991, was sold in 2016. The great Texas ranches, the ones with the deeper pockets and the louder names, eventually came to an end as private working operations under a single unbroken ownership. Pitchfork did not. Today, the home ranch covers roughly 165,000 acres. Some descriptions put the broader operation near 181,000 acres when you include the Oklahoma satellite. It runs around 4,500 mother cows. Its horse program continues with broodmares, stallions, and an annual sale that draws buyers from across the industry. Its oil operation has drilled more than 500 wells. By almost any measure, the ranch is larger and more complex today than when D.B. Gardner and Eugene Williams signed their papers in 1883. You could call that stubbornness. You could call it luck. You could call it the reward of discipline, or the reward of capital, or the reward of geography. The honest answer is probably closer to, we are not entirely sure. And that uncertainty is exactly what this story is about. Because survival in the ranch business is never clean. It is never one heroic decision or one great season. It is 100 quiet choices made under pressure by people who may not have known they were making history. And around Pitchfork, the pressure had a name. Several names, big ones. The kind of names that made smaller brands feel like they were always just one bad year away from being absorbed, sold, or forgotten. The ranch nobody expected to outlast the legends is still there, still fenced, still working, and the question of why is harder to answer than it looks. The friendship that should have been too risky. Every institution that survives long enough eventually becomes its own mythology. The founding story gets smoothed, the rough edges get filed away, the uncertainty gets replaced with a sense of inevitability. Pitchfork Ranch did this as well as any of them. But if you go back to the beginning, really back, before the traditions and the bloodlines and the oil wells, what you find is not destiny. What you find is a bet. D.B. Gardner was already ranching in West Texas when he and J.S. Godwin bought the Pitchfork brand and range in 1881. Gardner knew the land. He knew the cattle. He knew the rhythms of that particular stretch of country near the South Wichita River and the Croton Breaks. What he did not have was the depth of capital to build something that could last through bad years. The West Texas cattle business of the 1880s was not a stable investment. It was a volatile, weather-dependent, market-exposed gamble dressed up in leather and rope. Eugene F. Williams was not a rancher. He was a St. Louis businessman, the kind of man who understood ledgers, long-horizon investment, and the arithmetic of risk. The story that matters most about Williams is not what he eventually brought to the partnership, but how quickly he committed to it. According to one account, Williams agreed to back the Pitchfork operation before he had even seen the land or the cattle. He did not inspect the range. He did not ride out to count the herd. He trusted Gardner, and on the strength of that trust, the Pitchfork Land and Cattle Company was formally organized in 1883. Think about what that means. The ranch that would go on to outlast its larger and better-funded neighbors was founded, at its core, on one man trusting another man's word about land the investor had never touched. That should have been a disaster. The 1880s were not kind to Texas cattle operations that relied on outside capital and unfamiliar ground. The great die-up of 1886 and 87, when blizzards and drought killed cattle by the hundreds of thousands across the Great Plains, broke ranch operations that had seemed far more solid than anything Gardner and Williams had built. The era rewarded scale, proximity, and deep reserves. Pitchfork had only one of those three things in the early years, and yet the partnership held. Gardner stayed on as the field operator, the man who managed the hands and the range and the day-to-day reality of keeping cattle alive on rough West Texas ground. Williams stayed in St. Louis, keeping the financial structure sound, building reserves in good years that could carry the operation through bad ones. The combination worked not because either man was extraordinary in isolation, but because the division between them, one man doing the work, one man holding the math, turned out to be exactly the right architecture for what West Texas demanded. That architecture had a shadow side. Pitchfork's romance was always Texas. The legend of the place, the horsemanship, the cattle culture, the cookhouse, the land itself belonged to Texas. But the financial spine of the ranch, the reserve that kept it alive when markets collapsed or drought hit, belonged to St. Louis. That tension never fully disappeared. It just became part of the ranch's structure, folded into the story so gradually that later generations might not have seen it as a tension at all. You could argue that Pitchfork was never purely a Texas ranch story. You could argue it was always a story about what happens when outside capital meets local knowledge, and both sides of that partnership have the discipline not to wreck each other. Or you could argue the opposite, that Gardner's culture was so strong, so embedded in the land and the work and the traditions of the place, that the St. Louis money was just fuel. The culture was the engine. What you cannot argue is that either side of the partnership was unnecessary. In 1883, two men made a deal. One of them had never seen the land, one of them never left it. And that uncomfortable, probably improbable arrangement produced one of the longest surviving major ranches in American history. That is not a clean founding myth, but it might be a more honest one. Chapter 2. The Land Itself. Before you can understand what Pitchfork has survived, you have to understand what it sits on and inside of. Not as real estate, not as acreage numbers in a ledger, but as a physical presence, the kind of ground that teaches people what they are, whether they want to learn that lesson or not. Pitchfork Ranch occupies a particular stretch of West Texas that has never made survival easy. The South Wichita River runs through it. The Croton Breaks cut across the landscape in ways that make the terrain feel almost violent in places, cedar and brush dropping into draws, rough caprock country giving way to rolling grass, shade rare and heat enormous in summer. It is not the dramatic, photogenic landscape of the hill country or the Davis Mountains. It is quieter than that and harder than that, and in some ways more demanding than either. The ranch's geography gave it things that its neighbors did not always have. The broken country of the breaks offered shelter and water. The grass, when the rainfall cooperated, could support a serious cattle operation. The isolation, the particular combination of distance and rough terrain, meant that outside pressure was always a little slower to arrive than it might have been on flatter, more accessible ground. The land was not generous, exactly, but it was specific. It rewarded people who knew it, and it punished people who tried to impose a system on it rather than learning what the system already was. The cookhouse was where the human center of that system lived. Pitchfork's cookhouse became one of the most durable symbols the ranch produced, not because it was grand, but because it was used. From around 1900, the cookhouse served as the gathering place for the ranch's cowboys, the daily anchor of work and routine and institutional memory. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, season after season, and decade after decade. The bell that called men to eat was not a romantic gesture. It was a signal that the day's work was divided into before and after, that something predictable existed at the center of a business defined by weather, price, and animal unpredictability. That cookhouse remained in active use until 2007, over a century of continuous service, before being moved to the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock. Even that move was, in its way, a statement. The ranch did not let the building rot and fall. It sent the cookhouse somewhere that would remember what it meant. That is not a sentimental gesture from an organization that does not think about continuity. That is an organization that has always known continuity is not an accident. The land also shaped the kind of management Pitchfork required. The Croton Breaks in the South Wichita River country were not easy territory to run cattle on carelessly. You needed men who knew the draws, knew where cattle could get into trouble, knew how to gather rough country without losing the herd in the brush. That practical necessity shaped hiring philosophy in ways that may have had long-term cultural consequences. Dan Gardner, the founding manager, reportedly preferred older, settled men, not the drifting cowboys who might work a season and move on, but men who would stay, learn the specific land, and become part of the institution. That preference sounds like a management philosophy, but it was also almost certainly a response to geography. You cannot run the Croton Breaks efficiently with a different crew every season. You need people who know where the cattle hide, where the water runs, where the fence gaps are, and where the land will give you trouble before you see it coming. The country demanded a particular kind of loyalty from the people who worked it, and the ranch's traditions grew around that demand. There is one other thing the land gave Pitchfork that does not appear on any map until you know what to look for. Under the grass, under the caliche and the clay and the South Wichita River bottom, there was oil, not in amounts that the early ranchers could have known about or planned for, not in a way that was ever part of the founding story. But the ground that Gardner and Williams agreed to operate in 1883 happened to sit over a geological formation that would, eventually, produce something beyond cattle and horses and grass. The full weight of that fact would not arrive for almost a century. But the land had already made its decision about what it was holding underneath the surface. The geography of Pitchfork was never passive. It protected and it demanded. It isolated and it disciplined. It gave the ranch a character that no management philosophy alone could have created, and it imposed a logic of survival that the ranch either learned to obey or did not survive long enough to pass down. The ones who stayed learned to obey it. Chapter 3. Boom Country, Bust Country. To understand what Pitchfork survived, you first have to understand what the cattle business actually was during the years when the ranch was being built. Not the romance version, not the version with clean boots and open range and a sunset behind the herd. The actual version, the economic version, the one that ended careers and erased fortunes and turned empires into grass within a decade. The Texas cattle boom of the 1870s and early 1880s was one of the great speculative manias of the American West. Capital flooded into ranch land from Scotland, from England, from Chicago, from New York, from St. Louis. The numbers seemed to support the enthusiasm. Cattle bought for a few dollars a head on the southern plains could be sold for 2 or 3 times that amount in northern markets. The open range appeared endless, the grass appeared free, the math appeared simple. None of those appearances were accurate. The grass was not free. It was borrowed from land that had not yet been claimed or fenced, and the moment enough ranchers borrowed it simultaneously, it began to collapse under the weight of overgrazing. The math was not simple. It depended on weather, on market prices, on railroad access, and on the ability to hold a large operation together through years when none of those factors cooperated. And the capital that flooded in was, in many cases, impatient capital, money that expected returns on a timeline the cattle business could not reliably deliver. The collapse, when it came, was thorough. The winter of 1886 and 87 became the marker event, the Great Die-Up, as it came to be called. Temperatures dropped across the plains in ways that the ranching industry had not planned for and could not absorb. Cattle froze by the hundreds of thousands. Operations that had borrowed heavily to build their herds found themselves holding debt against a dead asset. The speculative energy that had built the open-range cattle industry turned almost overnight into a reckoning. By 1888, the cattle boom was over. Pitchfork was not exempt from that pressure. No ranch in the region was. The question is not whether the ranch felt the crash. The question is whether it had the structure to survive it. And here, the Gardner-Williams partnership becomes more than a founding story. The combination of Texas Field Management and St. Louis Financial Reserve may have been exactly what an 1886 blizzard demanded. Gardner knew the land and could make decisions quickly. Williams had reserves deep enough to absorb a bad year without being forced to sell into a collapsed market. You could argue they were lucky. You could argue the reserves and the structure were the product of deliberate planning. The honest answer is probably both, and the distinction between planning and luck narrows considerably in retrospect. What the boom and bust cycle of the 1880s established was a basic fact about the Texas cattle business that every surviving ranch had to absorb. This industry does not reward the most aggressive expansion. It does not reward the most ambitious vision. What it rewards over the long run is the capacity to be still standing when the people who are bigger and louder are not. The cattle business runs in cycles: drought, flood, price collapse, price recovery, drought again, and the ranches that last are the ones whose ownership structure and financial architecture can absorb the lows without being forced to liquidate. After the die-up, fencing arrived. Pitchfork began fencing its range in 1887, not as a luxury or an aesthetic choice, but as a practical response to the fact that the open range was gone. The era of free grass was ending. The era of managed land was beginning. That transition cost money and required a willingness to accept a different kind of ranching, more controlled, more capitalized, more dependent on the quality of the land itself rather than the availability of borrowed range. Some ranches could not make that transition. The ones that had overextended in the boom years found themselves without the capital to build fences, improve stock, and adapt to a market that was demanding more than a steer at the end of a trail drive. The ones that survived were, almost by definition, the ones that had not spent everything they had during the good years. A ranch that runs 4,500 mother cows today on land it has held for more than 140 years did not survive by accident. But it also did not survive by heroism. It survived by staying solvent, when staying solvent was the rarest thing in the Texas cattle business. 52,500 acres in 1883. 165,000 acres in the modern era, 4,500 mother cows, more than 500 oil wells drilled, a horse remuda with roughly 50 broodmares, 80 saddle horses, and 4 stallions working today, 25,000 acres held by oil production, an estate that the boom-era investors who built competing ranches and lost them could not have imagined. That is what patience and structure look like when the ledger finally tells the full story. Boom country and bust country are the same country. The difference is what you brought into it. The St. Louis paradox. There is a version of the Pitchfork story that makes complete sense as a Texas story. Rough ground, hard men, long summers, short winters, cattle culture built from the inside out by people who knew the land and refused to leave it. That version is true. It is also incomplete, because threading through every chapter of Pitchfork's survival, visible if you look for it, running parallel to the cattle and the horses and the cookhouse and the gray remuda, is a financial line that does not begin and does not end in Texas. It begins in St. Louis. Eugene F. Williams was not a romantic figure. He was not a man who rode into the Croton breaks and fell in love with the horizon. He was a businessman who understood that certain industries, properly capitalized and properly managed, could produce long-term returns that more conventional investments could not. What he brought to the Pitchfork partnership was not vision in the cinematic sense. It was something more durable and more decisive, the willingness to hold a long position through bad markets, and the capital to make that willingness mean something. The Williams family connection did not end with Eugene. Multiple sources across decades describe the descendants of Eugene Williams continuing to hold ownership or control of the ranch. That continuity of ownership on the capital side, an unbroken family line staying connected to an investment through drought, price collapse, world wars, oil booms, and the slow erosion of the open-range era, is not a trivial detail. It may be the most important fact in the entire Pitchfork story. Think about what that kind of capital patience actually means in practice. When the cattle markets fell in the 1930s, when the drought years of the Dust Bowl era tested every working ranch in the southern plains, Pitchfork had a financial structure that could absorb losses without being forced to sell land. That is not a small thing. The history of Texas ranch breakup is largely a history of forced sales, operations that ran out of reserve, went into debt, and had to liquidate land at the worst possible time. The ranches that survived were often, at their core, the ranches that had a source of patient money behind them that could wait out the market. Pitchfork had St. Louis. That fact creates a particular kind of discomfort in the romantic version of the story. The cookhouse and the bell and the gray horses and the cowboy traditions, those are the symbols that make Pitchfork feel like something worth admiring, worth preserving, worth making a 68-minute documentary about. But they existed, in part, because a family of St. Louis investors understood the value of staying in and not panicking when the Texas cattle business gave them every reason to get out. The tension between St. Louis money and Texas culture was not a conflict exactly. The two sides of the partnership seemed to have understood their roles and respected the division between them. Gardner managed the land. Williams managed the capital. Later, managers managed the land. Later, Williams' descendants managed the capital. The culture that emerged from that arrangement was Texas through and through, the traditions, the horsemanship, the cattle practices, the sense of place. But the financial architecture that protected that culture during its most vulnerable decades was never purely local. You could read that as a corruption of the story. The ranch that presents itself as a monument to Texas ranching endurance turns out to have been backed by outside money. The cowboys and the cattle and the land were real, but the reserve that kept them in place came from somewhere else. Or you could read it as the honest version of how anything survives long enough to become a legend. Culture requires infrastructure. Tradition requires capital. The story that gets told about a place is usually the surface of the place, the visible, photographable, emotionally resonant surface. Underneath that surface is always a structure that is less romantic and more deliberate, and the structure is usually the reason the surface still exists. Pitchfork's surface is West Texas. Its structure runs through St. Louis. One of those two things is the story the ranch tells about itself. The other may be the reason the story is still being told at all, and there is something worth sitting with in that. If you asked the cowboys who gathered cattle in the Croton breaks, who ate at the long table in the cookhouse, who broke horses in the corrals and called the Pitchfork their home, whether they felt the presence of St. Louis in their daily work, the answer would almost certainly be no. The culture was real. The belonging was real. The distance between what the hands felt and what the ledger showed was not dishonesty. It was just the natural gap between the experience of a place and the economics that make the experience possible. That gap exists in almost every institution that lasts long enough to have traditions. The traditions are genuine. The money is invisible. The combination is the thing that survives. Chapter 4. Dan Gardner's System. In the cattle business, most things that matter do not announce themselves. The decisions that shape a ranch for a generation are rarely dramatic. They accumulate in hiring choices, in daily habits, in the way a foreman responds to a man who shows up late, or a cow that goes missing, or a fence that keeps coming down in the same place. The culture of an operation is built from below, from the texture of daily life, and by the time it is visible enough to name, it has usually been in place for years. Dan Gardner built the texture of Pitchfork Ranch. Gardner arrived as the founding field manager in 1881 and did not leave the role until he died in 1928, roughly 45 years of continuous management over the same ground, the same operation, the same institutional challenge of keeping a West Texas cattle ranch alive through the kind of history that West Texas produces. In those 45 years, he watched the open range era end, fencing arrive, the cattle industry crash and recover, and the culture of the American West shift from myth to memory. Through all of it, he stayed, and he managed, and he made choices. The choices that seem most consequential in retrospect were not the dramatic ones. Gardner was reportedly known for preferring a particular kind of employee, not the young, restless cowboy who might work a season and drift west, but older, settled men. Men with roots, or the willingness to put down roots, men who would stay. That preference probably made the ranch harder to staff in certain seasons. The drifting labor pool of the Texas cattle era was full of men who were good with cattle and horses and did not want to be anywhere long. Gardner, apparently, was not interested in building his operation around those men. The reason for that preference was probably not sentimental. It was practical. A ranch in rough country with specific knowledge requirements, where the cattle hide, where the water is, where the fence gives way, what the ground does in a wet year, cannot function at full efficiency with a rotating workforce. The knowledge that makes an operation safe and productive in difficult terrain is not portable. It lives in people who stay long enough to learn it, and it transfers to the next generation of workers through proximity, not instruction. Gardner seems to have understood that the most valuable thing he could accumulate, beyond land and cattle, was men who knew the land and the cattle the way he did. That understanding produced traditions. The cookhouse became the daily anchor, because a workforce that stays needs a center. The rituals of the ranch, the bell, the meals, the rhythms of gather and work and rest, became the social infrastructure of an institution that needed its people to feel that they belonged to something worth staying for. Gardner did not invent those rituals as a management strategy in any modern sense, but they served a management purpose, and they survived him. He was also connected to something larger than the ranch itself. Gardner was reportedly among the men who helped draft plans in 1877 for what became the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, one of the formative institutions of the American cattle industry. That connection mattered. It meant that Pitchfork's founding manager was not a peripheral figure in Texas ranch history, but someone embedded in the networks through which information, influence, and industry standards moved. The ranch he ran was, from the beginning, part of a larger system, not isolated from it. When Gardner died in 1928, something that is very difficult to replace passed with him. Not the land, not the cattle, not the financial structure. Those could all be managed by successors. What passed was a particular kind of institutional authority, the authority of a man who had been the living memory of the place for nearly half a century, who had made decisions under every condition the Texas cattle business could produce, and who had accumulated knowledge that was inseparable from his person. What is remarkable is what came after him. The managers who followed Gardner, Virgil Parr, D. Burns, Jim Humphreys, Bob Morehouse, and Brooks Hodges among them, were not handed a myth and told to maintain it. They were handed a functional operation and told to keep it running, and they did. In recent accounts, only 6 managers followed Gardner in the entire history of the ranch. 6. In an industry defined by turnover and transition, and the brutal arithmetic of hired labor, 6 managers across roughly a century of operation is not just a statistic. It is a structural fact about how Pitchfork was built to work. D. Burns, who managed through the 1940s, once wrote something that tells you more about the ranch's internal culture than any official description ever could. He wrote simply, "Christmas is for women and children. That is not a warm sentiment. It is a statement of discipline, so absolute it sounds almost like a joke until you realize it was not." The ranch ran on the year-round commitment of the people who worked it, and that commitment was expected without negotiation. The holidays that the rest of the country organized itself around were, at Pitchfork, just more days. The cattle did not stop needing care because December had arrived. You could call that hardness. You could call it the price of continuity. What you cannot call it is an accident. Gardner built a system. The system built habits. The habits built traditions. The traditions became the identity of the place, and that identity, as much as any balance sheet or legal structure, is probably what the Williams family looked at when they decided, decade after decade, that this was still worth holding. Chapter 5. Horses that had to work. In most ranch histories, the horse program shows up as a grace note, something to mention after the cattle numbers and the acreage figures, a sign of culture and taste rather than a core business function. Pitchfork's horse program was never a grace note. It was infrastructure. Before helicopters, before all-terrain vehicles, before the mechanization of the American ranch made the horse optional, the quality of a working remuda was directly connected to the quality of a ranch's operation. A working cowboy on a capable horse could cover ground, gather cattle, and hold a herd in rough country in ways that nothing else could match. A cowboy on a poor horse was a cowboy working harder for worse results. The Pitchfork remuda was functional before it was famous. The horse program that eventually produced what people call the Pitchfork Gray had its origins in a practical problem. South Texas cattle work in broken country required horses that could handle distance, rough terrain, and the daily physical demands of working cattle for long seasons. The horses that could do that work tended to share certain qualities: soundness, endurance, the willingness to keep working when the terrain got harder and the hours got longer. The genetics that produced those qualities were worth identifying and preserving, not as an aesthetic project, but as an operational necessity. The horse program, as it is known today, began to take shape in 1941 when Pitchfork manager Rudolph Swenson acquired a stallion named Seal Brown, the ranch's first registered quarter horse. Seal Brown worked as a foundation, producing horses with the combination of athleticism and tractability that the ranch's cattle work demanded. When Seal Brown died, the ranch did not simply replace him. In 1946, they acquired a stallion named Joe Bailey's King, a horse whose lineage would eventually define what a pitchfork horse looked and moved like for generations. The gray color that became associated with the ranch was not originally a brand statement. It was a genetic outcome, what happened when certain bloodlines were bred consistently over time. But once it became visible, once the pitchfork gray became recognizable as a type, the ranch was wise enough to understand what it had. The horses were no longer just working animals. They were a living advert for the ranch's consistency and its standards. In 1963, Pitchfork held its first horse sale, offering 50 horses to buyers who came for the quality of the animals and left with a piece of what the ranch had been building for more than 20 years. That first sale generated major publicity, not because 50 horses is a large number, but because the horses had a story attached to them. They came from a place with a continuous breeding program, continuous management, and a reputation for producing animals that did exactly what you needed them to do. Today, the horse sale is held at the 4-6's ranch. That detail is worth sitting with. Two of the most recognizable brands in West Texas, neighbors with every reason to maintain a competitive distance, collaborate on an event that serves the interests of both. Whatever the relationship between Pitchfork and the 4-6's looks like from the outside, neighboring giants, comparable legends, operations that grew up in the same landscape and the same industry, it does not look like rivalry in the horse sale. It looks like two institutions that understand their shared interests better than the narrative of competition would suggest. The current remuda runs roughly 50 broodmares, 4 stallions, and around 80 to 125 saddle horses, depending on the season and the source. The horses are still working horses. They are still bred for the function Gardner's first cowboys demanded of them, but they are also now one of the most visible and marketable expressions of the ranch's identity, the thing that connects the operation's daily work to its reputation, the thing that makes a buyer at the horse sale feel like they are acquiring not just an animal, but a piece of something that has been built carefully over a very long time. That is not nothing. In an industry where reputation is often the only thing that keeps a price premium alive, a horse program that has been running continuously for more than 80 years, producing animals recognizable by their color and their quality, is an asset that does not appear on any balance sheet, but matters every time someone writes a check. The horses at Pitchfork had to work. They still do. But somewhere along the way, they also learned how to earn their keep in a second currency, the currency of identity and symbol, and the particular kind of trust that comes from watching something stay the same long after everything around it has changed. Chapter 6. Cattle, not legend, paid the bills. Strip away the horses, the cookhouse, the St. Louis money, the gray remuda, the oil wells, the archival records, and the horse sale at the 4-6's, and what you have left is the thing the ranch has always been, at its base, before the mythology arrived. A cattle operation. Cows, grass, water, fences, and the annual gamble that the animal on the ground today will be worth more at the market than it cost to raise. That is what Pitchfork has always been. And the history of how it managed that base operation, what cattle it ran, how it adapted to market demands, how it moved from one breed and one system to another over 140 years, is not a story about tradition. It is a story about adaptation, sometimes quiet, sometimes decisive, always driven by the practical question of what the market was paying and what the land could support. The purebred Hereford program began in 1935 with 100 purebred Hereford cows and a bull named Ike Domino. The Hereford was the dominant commercial cattle breed in the southern plains in that era, a breed valued for its hardiness, its ability to gain weight on native grass, and its widespread acceptance in feedlots and at auction. Starting a purebred operation in the middle of the 1930s, during the worst drought in the memory of most working ranchers, was not the obvious move. But Pitchfork made it, and the purebred program it built gave the ranch's cattle operation a quality marker that would pay dividends for decades. The breed mix shifted over time. By the modern era, Pitchfork was running Black Baldies and other Angus-influenced crosses alongside its traditional cattle program, a move that reflected the market's shift toward Angus-influenced beef and the practical reality that commercial buyers by the late 20th century expected a product that fed efficiently and graded well. A ranch that ran the same genetics in 1990 that it had run in 1935 would have found itself producing cattle the market had moved past. Pitchfork moved with the market, not frantically, not at the cost of its overall system, but it moved. The modern cattle operation at the home ranch runs around 4,500 mother cows. The program includes source and age verification and has participated in natural beef and branded beef programs that reflect the market's growing demand for traceable, quality documented product. These are not sentimental additions to the operation. They are responses to what buyers were willing to pay a premium for, and they required investment in record-keeping and management systems that the original Pitchfork operation would not have recognized. Some ranch stories present the continuity of the operation as evidence that the management philosophy never changed, that what worked in 1883 still works today, and the proof is the survival itself. That version of the story is satisfying. It is also probably backwards. The more accurate reading of Pitchfork's cattle operation is that it survived precisely because management was willing to change the cattle program when the market demanded it, while keeping the cultural infrastructure, the land, the hands, the traditions, the financial discipline, stable enough to absorb the changes without losing the identity of the place. 4,500 mother cows on 165,000 acres in West Texas is not a heritage preservation project. It is a production system. It requires decisions about genetics, about stocking rates, about supplemental feeding, about health programs, about marketing and timing, and the constant recalibration that a commodity business demands from the people running it. The legend of Pitchfork is built around continuity. The cattle operation that pays for the legend is built around adaptation. Both things are true. And the tension between them, the question of how much a place can change before it stops being itself, is one that Pitchfork has been navigating, probably without ever explicitly naming it, since D.B. Gardner and Eugene Williams first counted cattle on that rough West Texas ground in 1883. The cookhouse fed people. The horses moved them. The oil eventually enriched the operation in ways no one planned for. But the cattle paid the bills. They always did. And the decisions made about those cattle, which bulls to buy, which crosses to run, which markets to pursue, which programs to join, were the decisions that kept the books from running the wrong direction in the years when everything else the ranch relied on was under pressure. That is not a romantic story, but it is the story underneath the romantic one. And without it, there is no romantic story to tell. The managers who kept the ranch feeling like itself. There is a kind of continuity that belongs to families, the biological kind, where land passes from parent to child, and the name on the deed stays the same across generations. And then there is another kind of continuity, less celebrated and perhaps more difficult to maintain, the institutional kind, where an operation passes from one trusted steward to the next, and what survives is not a name, but a standard. Pitchfork practiced both. But the institutional continuity, the chain of managers who carried the ranch's operating philosophy forward through more than a century of change, may be the less obvious and more consequential of the two. After Dan Gardner died in 1928, the ranch did not stumble into the question of succession. It moved from Gardner to Virgil V. Parr, who managed through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Parr is credited in later accounts with meaningful improvements to the cattle, the horses, and the rangeland, not just with maintaining what Gardner had built, but with advancing it. That distinction matters. A manager who treats his predecessor's system as sacred will preserve the form of an institution while allowing it to age poorly underneath. A manager who treats the form as a foundation and builds from it will leave something stronger than he found. Parr was followed by D. Burns, who took over in 1942. Burns managed through the war years and into the early post-war period, a stretch of American history that tested ranch operations in ways that had nothing to do with weather or cattle prices. Labor markets shifted. Mechanization was beginning to change the economics of agricultural production. The cultural world that had shaped the original Pitchfork workforce was dissolving around the edges, and ranch managers across the South Plains were discovering that the traditions they had inherited required active maintenance rather than passive assumption. Burns's famous line, "Christmas is for women and children," was not just a statement about holidays. It was a statement about the total commitment culture that had made the ranch function since Gardner's time, and it was a statement made during years when total commitment was becoming harder to find and harder to demand. The fact that Burns said it, the fact that it was remembered and repeated, suggests that the culture it described was already something that required defense by the time it was articulated. Jim Humphreys followed in 1965, and Bob Morehouse arrived in 1973, eventually becoming what many accounts describe as one of the defining managers of Pitchfork's modern era. Morehouse's tenure overlapped with the oil program's development, with the evolution of the cattle genetics, with the horse sales growth, and with the long, gradual process by which the ranch's identity crystallized from the living experience of a working operation into something more consciously articulated, a brand, a heritage, a story that the ranch itself was learning to tell. Morehouse once described the animating force of the operation as simply love of the pitchfork. That is the kind of statement that sounds like public relations and may instead be the most accurate thing ever said about the place. An institution that produces that feeling in its managers, not loyalty to an employer in the abstract, but a specific personal attachment to a particular piece of ground and a particular way of working it, has accomplished something that no management training program can engineer from scratch. It grows from the culture Gardner built and the land the ranch sits on, and the 100 small rituals and standards and expectations that accumulated across a century and a half of continuous operation. Brooks Hodges manages the ranch in the current era. The continuity of that managerial chain, 6 managers following Gardner, each one apparently chosen for their capacity to carry forward what the ranch had built while adapting what the ranch required, is not a small thing. It is a structural argument that Pitchfork's survival was not accidental. Organizations that stumble through leadership transitions produce visible disruptions in culture, in output, in the morale of the people doing the daily work. Pitchfork's transitions, by all evidence, produced something different. They produced evolution without rupture. The managers are not the heroes of this story exactly. The land and the cattle and the capital and the culture all had their roles. But the managers are the connective tissue, the people who made the abstract commitments of the Williams family real and who made the daily demands of the ranch intelligible to the men and women who worked it. Without that connective tissue, the best capital in the world and the most distinctive horse program in West Texas would still be vulnerable to the slow institutional decay that dismantles organizations that lose the thread between what they are and what they do. Pitchfork kept the thread. 6 times, across a century of trying, it kept the thread. Chapter 7. 4 Sixes, the Literal Shadow. Drive through Guthrie, Texas, and you will understand immediately that this is not a neutral landscape. Guthrie is a small town, small in the way that rural West Texas towns are small, where every building has a function, and every function is legible, and nothing is there by accident. And the thing that is most not there by accident in the story of Guthrie is the 4 Sixes Ranch, whose headquarters shaped the town, whose history defined the region, and whose name became, over more than a century and a half, one of the most recognizable brands in American ranching culture. The 4 Sixes began with Samuel Burke Burnett, who built his cattle operation in the 1860s and expanded it, decade by decade, into one of the defining Texas ranch institutions, more than 250,000 acres. A headquarters presence in Guthrie that made the town feel less like a separate community and more like an extension of the ranch's administrative world. Generations of family ownership, the kind of accumulated cultural weight that turns a working operation into a historical fact. For Pitchfork, the 4 Sixes was not an abstraction. It was the neighbor. It was the literal nearby giant, the ranch that Pitchfork operated beside, competed with in the same markets, participated in the same regional culture with, and measured itself against whether it wanted to or not. When Pitchfork's people thought about what a major Texas ranch looked like, the 4 Sixes was always in the frame. That proximity could have been suffocating. It was certainly pressure. Operating beside a brand as large and as recognized as the 4 Sixes meant that Pitchfork's choices were always being made in a context that included comparison. The 4 Sixes was bigger. The 4 Sixes was, in many ways, more famous. The 4 Sixes had more land, a longer public profile, and the kind of glamour that attached itself to large operations with storied histories and Hollywood proximity. Yellowstone came to the 4 Sixes because the 4 Sixes looked like what most people imagine when they imagine a Texas ranch. Pitchfork did not look like that. Pitchfork looked like a working ranch, which is either a lesser thing or a more honest thing, depending on where you stand. But the relationship between the two ranches is not a story of rivalry, however much the proximity and the contrast might suggest it. The most telling single fact about the relationship between Pitchfork and the 4 Sixes is this. Pitchfork sells its horses at an event hosted at the 4 Sixes Ranch. 2 major West Texas brands, occupying the same cultural space, neighboring each other across a landscape that offers limited room for both to be the biggest thing in it, and they collaborate on one of the most visible expressions of each ranch's identity. That is not a narrative of competition. That is a narrative of coexistence and possibly of mutual recognition. 2 operations that understand what they are well enough to see that what the other is doing is not a threat. And then, in 2022, the 4 Sixes was sold. After more than 150 years of family ownership, after surviving the same droughts, cattle crashes, market collapses, and inheritance challenges that had broken other ranches, the 4 Sixes changed hands. It was not a collapse. It was not a disaster in the catastrophic sense. but it was an ending of a particular kind. The family that had held the ranch since Burke Burnett's era was no longer the family that held it. The continuity that the 4 Sixes represented, the specific continuity of land, family, and name across generations, was over. Pitchfork, as of this telling, has not been sold. The shadow. The 4 Sixes cast over Pitchfork was real, and it was not only geographic. It was the shadow of what could happen even to the biggest operations, even to the ones with the most resources, the most fame, and the most years of accumulated cultural authority. It was the shadow of time, moving across institutions the way it moves across everything, not destroying them always, but eventually requiring them to change, transfer, or end. Pitchfork stood in that shadow for over a century and kept working. The 4 Sixes was the literal example of everything Pitchfork measured itself against, and what happened to the 4 Sixes is part of the story of what Pitchfork has, so far, managed to avoid. Whether that avoidance was earned or fortunate or some combination of both is a question the landscape around Guthrie has not finished answering. Chapter 8. Wagoner, the giant that proves size is not safety. If the 4 Sixes was Pitchfork's neighbor, the Wagoner Ranch was Pitchfork's cautionary tale, the argument written in land, cattle, oil, and legal documents that size alone does not guarantee permanence, and that the things most likely to break a great ranch are not weather or markets, but the human complications that accumulate when an empire passes from one generation to the next. The Wagoner Empire did not become large incrementally. It expanded. Between 1889 and 1903, the Wagoner family assembled more than 1 million acres across the Red River country of North Texas, a landholding so enormous that it occupied parts of 6 counties and contained resources that would have been unimaginable to the first generation of Texas ranchers who had built their operations on open range and hope. Dan Wagoner and his son W.T. Wagoner were the architects of that expansion, and they built in the era when expansion was the logic of the cattle business. Get more land, run more cattle, build a bigger infrastructure. The Wagoner did all of those things on a scale that few operations in American history have matched. And when oil arrived under the Wagoner Range, as it did for many of the great West Texas and North Texas landholdings, the financial dimensions of the operation shifted into a register that the original cattle economy could barely have imagined. For decades, the Wagoner was not just a ranch. It was an argument about what private wealth in Texas could become, how large, how durable, how impervious to the forces that diminished smaller operations. The size was the point. The size was supposed to be the protection. 1 million acres could absorb a drought that would wipe out a 50,000-acre ranch. 1 million acres, sitting above significant oil production, should have been able to absorb almost anything. What it could not absorb was the family itself. The inheritance conflict that eventually dismantled the Wagoner's integrity as a single operation lasted for years and reached into the courts in ways that put the ranch's internal fractures on public display. By 1991, when an estate valuation produced a number of more than $330 million, the Wagoner was still one of the largest and most valuable private landholdings in America. And it was still being fought over by the people who had inherited it, whose competing claims to the land and its resources had produced a legal conflict that no amount of acreage could paper over. In 2016, a court ordered the sale of the Wagoner Ranch. The buyer was Stan Kroenke, a sports and real estate billionaire who already owned significant ranch properties elsewhere. 520,000 acres, a fraction of the Wagoner's peak acreage, but still one of the largest contiguous private landholdings in the United States, changed hands not because the land had lost its value, but because the family that owned it could not agree on how to hold it together. The lesson the Wagoner teaches is not about cattle or oil or management or any of the operational factors that ranch historians usually focus on. The lesson is about what happens when the human infrastructure of a great ranch fails. The land can survive almost anything. The cattle can be replaced. The oil will keep producing as long as the geology cooperates. What cannot be replaced once it fractures is the agreement among the people who own something that the thing is worth more whole than divided. Pitchfork's ownership structure, the Williams family providing capital continuity across generations, the managerial chain providing operational continuity, avoided the specific failure mode that broke the Wagoner. Whether by design or by luck or by the particular personality of the Williams family across multiple generations, the kind of inheritance conflict that dragged the Wagoner through the courts never materialized in the way it needed to in order to force a sale. The Wagoner story does not make Pitchfork look heroic by contrast. It makes Pitchfork look fortunate or careful or both. And it establishes something that the cattle and horse and oil numbers cannot establish on their own. Survival in the ranch business requires not just operational skill and financial discipline, but also a basic capacity for the people in charge to remain in agreement about what they are trying to do. The Wagoner had the land. It had the oil. It had the history and the name and the deep roots in Texas ranch culture. It had everything except the agreement. Size is not safety. The Wagoner proved that across more than a century of growth and one devastating generation of conflict, Pitchfork, watching from its position in the landscape, absorbed that lesson in whatever way institutions absorb lessons, not by naming them, probably, but by continuing to hold together the things that larger and wealthier neighbors let come apart. Chapter 9. The Quiet Expansion. The story Pitchfork tells about itself is largely a story about continuity, about holding on, staying true, refusing to disappear in a world that rewarded scale and liquidity over identity and permanence. That story is true. But it is not the complete story, because embedded within the narrative of staying the same is a different narrative, quieter and less celebrated, about how much the ranch actually changed in order to survive. Pitchfork in 1983 was not the same operation it had been in 1883. It could not have been. 100 years of weather, market shifts, technological change, regulatory evolution, and the slow transformation of the American cattle industry had made sure of that. The ranch's survival was not the survival of a static institution. It was the survival of something that learned, over and over, how to change just enough. At its largest, Pitchfork operated more land than the home ranch alone. The Wyoming Flag Ranch was one of its satellite operations, a separate property in a different state, a signal that the ranch's ownership was willing to expand geographically when the conditions supported it. In 1993, the Flag Ranch was sold. That sale was not a failure. It was a recalibration, the kind of decision that organizations with good judgment make when a piece of the portfolio no longer serves the core operation as well as it once did. Around the same time, more Texas land was added to the home operation. The current Oklahoma satellite adds another dimension to the footprint. Today, some materials describe the broader Pitchfork operation at near 181,000 acres when the full picture is assembled. That number is larger than the home ranch alone, and it is larger than the ranch was in its first decades of operation. That is not a story about holding on. That is a story about selective growth, knowing when to expand, knowing when to consolidate. and keeping both decisions in service of a larger continuity that the outside observer might mistake for simple preservation. The selective quality of the expansion matters as much as the expansion itself. Pitchfork did not grow by acquiring everything it could acquire. It grew by identifying what belonged to the core operation and what did not. The Flag Ranch, in the end, apparently did not. Texas land, in the end, apparently did. Oklahoma acreage, apparently, adds something that the home ranch needs. The pattern of those decisions, taken together, looks less like a ranch that refused to change and more like a ranch that changed in the ways that protected the thing it was trying to protect. This is where the story of Pitchfork becomes genuinely complicated for anyone who wants to read it simply. The ranch that survived by staying true to itself was also, throughout its history, a ranch that made pragmatic decisions about what staying true actually required. Selling a satellite operation when it no longer fit, adding land when the opportunity supported the core program, diversifying into oil when the geology made it possible, participating in branded beef programs when the market rewarded traceability, hosting a horse sale in partnership with a neighboring ranch when collaboration served both operations better than competition. None of those decisions feel like the actions of an institution that believed survival means holding still. They feel like the actions of an institution that understood survival means moving in the right directions at the right times and being steady enough in its identity that the movement didn't register as contradiction. There is a version of Pitchfork's story that says it survived because it never compromised, and there is a version that says it survived because it knew exactly which compromises to make and which ones to refuse. The first version is easier to celebrate. The second version is probably more accurate. What makes the ranch's selective evolution so useful as a story is that it mirrors something real about how any long-lived institution actually functions. The ones that insist they never change are either lying or they are already dying. The ones that change in every direction available to them lose the identity that made them worth preserving. The ones that last are usually the ones navigating the narrow channel between those two failures, changing just enough, holding just enough, and knowing the difference between what the organization is and what the organization does. Pitchfork changed what it did many times across more than 140 years. What it is, on the evidence of its survival, appears to have stayed recognizable. That is not a small achievement. It might be the most important one. Oil under the grass. Every institution that survives long enough accumulates secrets, not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the structural sense. Things that were always present but not visible until you look at them from the right angle, at the right time, in the right light. For Pitchfork Ranch, the secret that changes the shape of the survival story is under the ground. The land that D.B. Gardner and Eugene Williams agreed to operate in 1883 sat above a geological formation that neither of them would have had reason to think about. They were cattle ranchers. They were thinking about grass and water and fencing and the price of beef at the Kansas City market. The idea that the ground itself might produce something beyond cattle forage was not part of the calculation. It could not have been. The West Texas oil industry did not yet exist in any meaningful form. It does now. Pitchfork's official oil page describes a program that, by any measure of a working cattle ranch's secondary business, is remarkable. More than 500 wells drilled on the property. More than 200 completions in the Tannehill Formation alone. Roughly 25,000 acres held by production. Wells averaging around 4,000 feet in the Tannehill. Millions of barrels produced since the program's modern development phase began. The numbers are not spectacular by the standard of a dedicated oil company, By the standard of a West Texas cattle ranch that began as a cattle ranch, they are extraordinary. The wells and the production are truly impressive. The question that the oil program raises, and that the ranch's own historical materials do not fully resolve, is when exactly the oil story began. The ranch's current Tannehill oil page dates the first major discovery to 1980. That is a specific and verifiable claim, and it positions the oil program as something that arrived relatively late in the ranch's history, after more than a century of survival on cattle and horses and financial discipline alone. On that reading, oil was a reward for endurance, not a factor in it. But the Texas State Historical Association's entry on Pitchfork Ranch mentions oil drilling activity at an earlier date, suggesting that the ranch's relationship with oil may be older than the 1980 account implies. The discrepancy between those two accounts is not trivial. If oil income was significant earlier in the ranch's history, then some of the survival story that looks like pure cattle economics may have had an underground subsidy that the surface narrative does not account for. That discrepancy may never be fully resolved, and perhaps it should not be. The gap between the official oil story and the historical record is not just a research problem. It is a window into something real about how institutions remember their own histories. Organizations tend to narrate their survival in terms of the values they want to celebrate: discipline, management, culture, breeding, rather than in terms of the factors that are harder to romanticize. Oil is harder to romanticize than a gray horse in the morning light of the Croton Breaks. A geological accident under the grass is harder to celebrate than 45 years of Dan Gardner's management philosophy. But the oil is there. 500 wells and 25,000 acres of production do not appear in the ledger as a footnote. They appear as a major business line, one that, in certain years, may have provided the margin of financial safety that allowed the cattle program to continue operating in ways that the cattle market alone might not have supported. Think about what the oil program represents in terms of the survival question this story keeps asking. Every answer that seems complete — culture, management, financial discipline, horse genetics, selective evolution — is adequate up to a certain point. And then you reach a moment, somewhere in the 1980s or earlier, when the ground under the ranch begins producing something that the founders never planned for. And suddenly the financial structure of the operation has a dimension that none of the cultural or managerial factors could have provided on their own. Was oil the backup plan? Was it the insurance policy that made all the other factors viable during the periods when cattle prices were low and drought years came in sequence and the market was asking hard questions about whether any West Texas ranch could justify its cost structure? Or was oil simply the hidden room in the house, something that was always there, always part of the property, always waiting to be discovered, and the discovery of it just confirmed what the land had always known about its own value? The ranch that presents itself as a cattle operation has 500 wells under its grass. 500. That is not a detail. That is a structural fact about what Pitchfork actually is. A diversified land enterprise that produces cattle and horses and oil and identities all at once on a single piece of West Texas ground that has never stopped giving more than it appeared to offer on the surface. The survival story looks different when you know what is underground. Not less impressive, necessarily, but different, more complicated, more honest, maybe, about the full range of factors that kept the lights on and the fences standing and the tradition alive long enough to become the tradition. More than 500 wells drilled, more than 200 Tannehill completions, 25,000 acres held by production, roughly 4,000 feet down on average in the Tannehill Formation, millions of barrels produced. And all of it underneath a ranch that will tell you, if you ask, that what it really does is raise cattle. Chapter 10. Rituals that outlived necessity. At some point in Pitchfork's history, and it is difficult to say exactly when, the ranch's daily rituals shifted from being purely practical to being something else. They became institutional memory. They became identity. They became the visible evidence that something was being preserved on purpose, not just maintained by momentum. The cookhouse was the center of this. From roughly 1900 until 2007, the cookhouse at Pitchfork served as the daily gathering place for the ranch's working people. 3 meals a day, the bell calling people in from whatever work they were doing across the property, the long table where cowboys sat together and ate food that had been prepared in the same building, in more or less the same way, for generations. Not as a tourist attraction, not as a heritage experience. As a working institution, the place where the social fabric of the ranch was renewed every single day by the act of people sharing food. That is over 100 years of continuous daily use. Think about what passes through a single building in 100 years. The men who ate there in 1905 were not the men who ate there in 1965. The food was different, the equipment was different, the trucks parked outside were different, but the structure of the ritual was the same. The bell rang, the people came, the table fed them, the day continued. The continuity resists simple explanation. There is something in that continuity that resists simple explanation. It would have been easy, at many points in the ranch's history, to modernize the feeding arrangements, to decentralize the meal structure, to let the cookhouse function retire as the logistics of the operation changed. Other ranches did exactly that. The cookhouse as a working institution is rare in the modern era precisely because the conditions that produced it, large resident workforces doing physically demanding work far from town, have largely disappeared. Pitchfork kept it going until 2007. And when it finally ended, the ranch did not let the building decay into a ruin. It was moved, physically relocated, to the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, where it stands as a preserved example of what daily ranch life looked like for the better part of a century. That act of preservation, the decision to give the cookhouse a future instead of letting it become a past, is itself a statement about what Pitchfork believes its history is worth. The horses are another version of this. The gray Remuda that became the visual signature of the Pitchfork operation was not always symbolic. It was functional, and then it became both. The horses that worked the Croton brakes in the 1940s and 1950s were not bred to look like Pitchfork horses. They were bred to work like Pitchfork horses. The color came later as a recognizable byproduct of the genetics, and the symbolism came later still, as the ranch learned that the gray Remuda was one of the most legible ways to communicate, at a glance, what the operation stood for. Today, the ranch's horse program still produces the gray horses that carry the brand identity. They still work cattle. They are still functional animals doing functional work. But they are also now ambassadors, animals that carry not just the genetics of the Pitchfork breeding program, but the accumulated meaning of 80-plus years of continuous breeding, continuous selection, and continuous use. The rituals that outlived their original necessity, the cookhouse meals, the gray horses, the annual horse sale, the traditions of gather and work, and the social structures that accompany them, did not survive because someone decided to preserve them as artifacts. They survived because the ranch's management understood, perhaps intuitively rather than explicitly, that the culture of a place is a form of operational infrastructure. It holds people together. It makes loyalty legible. It gives the people who work there a reason to stay that goes beyond wages and weather and the grinding practicality of the cattle business. Bob Morehouse described it as love of the pitchfork. That phrase sounds like sentiment, but sentiment, properly cultivated and maintained, is one of the most powerful forces in organizational life. It is the thing that makes people stay when leaving would be easier. It is the thing that makes managers serve an institution rather than simply administer it. It is the thing that turns a cattle ranch into something that people argue about and study and make documentaries about more than 140 years after it was founded. The rituals outlived their necessity. And then they became necessary in a different way. Necessary not for moving cattle or feeding cowboys, but for keeping alive the idea of what the ranch was and why it mattered. That transition from functional to symbolic is not always a warning sign. Sometimes it is the thing that saves you. Chapter 11. Beyond the Fence. Here is where the honest version of this story has to resist its own conclusions. After everything, the cattle and the oil and the horses and the cookhouse and the St. Louis money and the 6 managers and the 140 years of survival beside giants that did not survive, the temptation is to explain it, to find the single factor, the decisive variable, the element that, if removed from the equation, would have produced a different outcome. To give the audience the satisfaction of a clean answer, this is why Pitchfork lasted. That satisfaction is not available. Not honestly. What the evidence shows is a combination. Conservative management that did not overreach in the good years. Patient capital from the Williams family that could absorb the bad ones. A founding manager who built a culture strong enough to be inherited. A succession of stewards who carried that culture forward without freezing it. A horse program that produced functional animals and, eventually, recognizable identity. A cattle program that adapted to the market without losing the operation's core logic. A piece of land that turned out to have oil under the grass, arriving as either a reward or a rescue depending on when exactly you date the discovery. A management structure that made selective expansion possible without triggering the inheritance conflicts that broke larger operations, and the particular luck of never having a generation of ownership that chose to fight over what to do with all of it. Remove any one of those factors, and the story changes. Remove several of them, and Pitchfork becomes another great West Texas ranch that was, for a while, a going concern and is now a historical footnote. The 4 Sixes lasted more than 150 years in one family before it was sold. The Wagoner reached more than 1 million acres and still could not hold together past the generation that inherited it. Both of those ranches had resources that Pitchfork either never matched or matched only partially. Both of them had stories worth telling. And both of them eventually became properties with new owners. Pitchfork, as of this telling, has not. But it would be a mistake to read that fact as permanent. The forces that ended the 4 Sixes and the Wagoner, time, inheritance, market change, the slow erosion of the conditions that made a particular kind of institution viable, those forces are not done. They are not anywhere close to done. Every ranch that has survived the past century has survived into a present that poses its own questions about viability. The cattle market shifts. The oil market shifts. The labor force that makes a working ranch function is not the same as the labor force that existed in 1930 or 1960 or even 1990. The external pressures that test ranch operations do not stop because an operation has demonstrated that it can withstand them. Pitchfork has survived. It has not transcended the conditions that required survival. That distinction is important because the story this documentary has been building is not ultimately a story about a ranch that figured out how to be permanent. It is a story about a ranch that has, so far, been more capable of meeting the demands of its moment than the alternatives it was competing with. And there is a meaningful difference between those two things. The question that the audience should carry out of this is not why Pitchfork survived. The question is, what did survival actually cost, and who paid it? The cowboys who ate at the long table paid part of it. The managers who gave their working lives to the operation paid part of it. The Williams family, who held the capital through generations of change and pressure, paid part of it. The cattle that lived and died on the ranch's acreage over 140 years without any say in the matter paid part of it in the most literal sense. The rituals that were maintained past the point of strict necessity, at the cost of modernization and efficiency, paid part of it in a different currency. Survival in the ranch business is not free. It is not the reward of virtue. It is not the inevitable outcome of discipline or culture or capital or any other factor in isolation. It is the accumulated result of thousands of decisions, many of them made under pressure, by people who were doing their best with the information they had in the service of something they believed was worth preserving. Was it worth preserving? The ranch is still there. You can drive to Guthrie and see the fence. You can see the horses. You can find the records in the archives and trace the ledger back to 1883 and watch the numbers change and the land expand and the cattle multiply and the oil program grow and the managers succeed each other and the family hold on. You can see all of that and still not know, definitively, whether what survived is the thing worth celebrating or just the thing that happened to survive. The difference between those two conclusions is the gap where this story lives. Pitchfork endured, the fence is still there, and the question of why is still, after everything, genuinely open. Chapter 12. The fence kept cattle in and trouble out, but it never kept out drought, price collapse, inheritance, distance, or time. What may have saved Pitchfork was not one heroic choice. It may have been the harder thing, a ranch willing to let the myth stay on the surface while the real work happened underneath. The cookhouse bell rang for over 100 years. The gray horses moved through the Croton breaks season after season, bred toward a standard that was both practical and, eventually, beautiful. The managers came and stayed and kept the thread running between what the ranch had been and what it needed to become. The Williams family held the capital through the years when holding anything felt uncertain. The oil came out of the ground when the ground was ready to give it. None of those things, alone, would have been enough. Taken together, they produced 140 years of a working ranch on rough West Texas ground, larger today than when it began, more complex than its founders imagined, and more difficult to explain than the story it tells about itself. What saved Pitchfork? The honest answer is, we are not entirely sure. The cattle program helped, the capital helped, the managers helped, the oil helped, the culture helped, the geography helped. And maybe, if you believe that survival has a moral dimension, the refusal helped. The refusal to be absorbed, to sell, to divide, to choose the easier path over the one that kept the operation intact. The 4.6s was sold in 2022. The Wagoner was sold in 2016. Pitchfork is still working. If you had to choose one thing that saved it, what would you choose? The fence is still standing. The question still is, too.